There are moments in life when a single sentence can undo years of silence. It doesn't come with fanfare, just a few words, uttered casually, and suddenly the ground shifts beneath you. We don't always recognize the gravity of these moments while they're happening. Sometimes it feels like another ordinary night, another dinner, another round of pleasantries. But then someone speaks, and life cleaves into a before and an after. That evening in the Whitmore dining room was mine. The table glowed with Margaret's heirloom crystal, each goblet positioned as if measured by a ruler. The silverware gleamed beneath the chandelier, polished to perfection by a housekeeper who would never sit at this table. The roast glistened in its dish, surrounded by vegetables arranged more like decoration than nourishment. It was a scene curated for appearances, for reputation, for a family obsessed with looking whole, even when its foundation was already crumbling. Ethan, my husband of 6 years, stood at the head of the table. He wasn't usually the sort to command attention. Most nights, he slouched, let conversations swirl around him, and contributed only when pressed. But that night was different. He tapped his fork against the side of his wine glass, the clear chime pulling every gaze to him. "I've got an announcement," he said, puffing his chest slightly, enjoying the rare moment of authority. "I finally did something smart about Madison's little cabin. I sold it, $60,000, done deal." The words landed like a slap I wasn't allowed to flinch from. For a heartbeat, the room went still, the only sound the soft hum of Margaret's grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, like rehearsed actors hitting their cues, the Whitmore family erupted. "Brilliant move, son," Richard declared, his baritone voice filling the room like he was chairing a board meeting. Margaret clasped her pearls, eyes shining. "Oh, Ethan, finally some sense in this family." Mason let out a whistle, leaning back in his chair. "Man, 60 grand, and you didn't even use a realtor. That's slick." Even Ava, the newest addition to these dinners, clapped her manicured hands, her smile just a little too long, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. Their laughter rose, colliding with the clinking of glasses as if we were celebrating a promotion or a wedding or anything else worth toasting. But it wasn't a celebration, it was a funeral. They just didn't realize it yet. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, my place set slightly off center as it always was, as if my presence were an afterthought. My lips didn't part, my eyes didn't blink. Inside, my lungs burned with the effort of keeping air from spilling out in a gasp. My phone vibrated against my thigh. Once, twice, then again. The screen lit with a number I didn't recognize. I didn't move to answer. Not yet. Ethan's grin widened at my silence. He mistook it for defeat. "You see this dinner?" he said, sweeping his arm toward the elaborate spread. "The wine, the roast, the dessert that's coming, it's all covered. The money from the cabin paid for tonight. At least one meal is on the house." The laughter swelled again, bouncing off the crystal, echoing against Margaret's carefully chosen wallpaper. My ears rang with it, though it wasn't the sound itself that hurt. It was the familiarity. I knew this script. Ethan cast himself as the provider, the clever one, the savior of the family's resources. And I was the careless wife who had to be corrected, whose mistakes had to be managed. I wanted to scream that the cabin had never been a mistake. It had been my salvation, my rebellion, my one act of claiming something for myself. But years of practice had taught me silence was often safer than words. So I stayed still. My phone vibrated again, insistent, almost frantic now. Whoever was on the other end wasn't going to give up. I glanced at Ethan, who was basking in the glow of his family's applause, his face flushed with the intoxication of approval. He hadn't noticed the sharp edge in my jawline, the way my hands clenched under the tablecloth. He never noticed. Margaret lifted her glass, her voice rising above the chatter. "To Ethan, for proving once again that leadership runs in the family." They all raised their glasses, all except me. My hand stayed on my lap, my phone still trembling with the urgency of something that felt far bigger than this dinner table. It's strange how truth arrives. Sometimes it's whispered, sometimes it's shouted, and sometimes it hums against your skin in the vibration of a phone call you don't want to take. That night, as the Whitmores laughed and toasted and congratulated themselves, I knew the call in my pocket would change everything. I didn't know how yet, but I knew. The air in the room grew thicker with every cheer. The chandelier seemed too bright, the roast too rich, the wine too heavy. My throat ached with the effort of swallowing everything I wanted to say. Outside, through the window, the October night pressed against the glass. The trees stood silent and watchful, as if they already knew what was about to happen. Inside, my husband grinned like a man who believed he had just secured his legacy. And I, still silent, sat in the shadows of my own marriage, waiting for the phone in my pocket to tell me what came next. Before the call kept buzzing in my pocket, there were 6 quiet years that trained me to hear it and pretend I didn't. Disappearing doesn't happen all at once. It's not a vanishing act so much as an erosion, one grain of sand carried off by 1,000 small tides, until the shoreline of you looks different and no one can remember when it changed. Every morning of those years began with the same choreography. I rose first. I ground the beans, measured the water, and set out a mug for Ethan, white ceramic, a hairline crack near the handle he never noticed, 2 spoonfuls of sugar he never thanked me for. He would scroll his phone at the kitchen table while I cooked eggs, his face lit blue with the lives of other people. If I said good morning, he nodded at the screen. Sometimes he didn't. The house had a way of amplifying silence, the soft click of the fridge door, the ritual pop of the toaster, the slight hiss when the faucet woke. I filled those sounds with my own small assurances, the way a person humming reassures herself in a dark hallway. I was the hum in my marriage. On Sundays, the Whitmore house pulled us in like a tide. Margaret hosted with military precision. Her table was a theater set. I was expected to appear as a supporting character who passed plates and didn't interrupt the monologues. She would ask Ethan about his week, his numbers, his prospects. "How's the pipeline?" she'd say, as if forecast spreadsheets were living, breathing things. To me, she would say, "Madison, dear, you remembered the rosemary this time, didn't you?" And smile like I'd finally managed to follow a simple instruction. The rosemary sat in a jar I'd labeled and dated, organized the way I organized everything, because if I didn't, things got lost. Richard preferred grand declarations. He spoke of markets as if they were weather systems only he could read. "Times like these favor bold moves," he'd say, carving a roast as though he were cutting a ribbon. He and Ethan traded stock tips across the table like boys swapping baseball cards. If I contributed, if I dared mention my work, my clients, a win, I could feel the table's temperature drop a degree. Margaret would refill Ethan's wine. Richard would check his watch. The message hovered unsaid. "This is not your arena." In year 2, I earned a promotion. The kind they announce at company meetings and frame in glass. 45 minutes after I told Ethan, his brother scratched off a lottery ticket at Sunday dinner and won $50. There were toasts. There were photos. Margaret said it was a sign of Mason's financial savvy. I brought dessert in from the kitchen like good news no one heard. Later that night, I found a crumb of cake on the floor and knelt to pick it up, and I realized that most of the time I was kneeling in this family, reaching into low cabinets, clearing the space under chairs, tidying the places other people forgot existed. When the Whitmores forgot to set a place for me on the 4th of July, Margaret laughed it off. "We're all family," she said, sliding a salad plate in front of me, the silverware mismatched with everyone else's. "We share." That was the word they liked best when it came to my time, my labor, my paychecks. Share. Sharing in practice meant my resources were community property and my victories were private. Disappearing has markers if you know where to look. The first is the loss of witnesses. I once told Ethan about a difficult client, how I'd stayed late, how I'd solved something that had nodded for months. He kissed my forehead without meeting my eyes. "That's great, Maddie," he said, already walking away. Later, I recounted the same story to the mirror while brushing my teeth because I needed at least one person to say, "I saw you do that." The mirror didn't argue. I began to keep a ledger, not of dollars, but of moments. The night Ethan forgot our anniversary and bought himself a new golf driver the next morning. The breakfast when he asked me to iron a shirt while I was already dressed for work. The party where he introduced me as the logistics behind the operation, like I was a spreadsheet with legs. None of these were crimes, each was a subtraction. Year 3 brought the cabin. It started as a thought so small I hushed it when it spoke. What if there was a place that belonged only to me? I took on extra work, freelance compliance audits I could do after dinner when the house quieted. I packed leftovers for lunches. I told no one. The savings grew in secret, and with it, a feeling I had almost forgotten: anticipation. The first time I drove up that narrow road through pines, October light fell in slanted ribbons across the hood of my car. Ruth met me on the porch with a set of keys and a smile like old quilts and cinnamon. "It's not much," she warned, and I believed her until I stepped inside and felt my bones unclench. The walls were cedar, soft with age. The deck groaned when I walked it, but it held. Through the window, the pond sat still as if it had sworn not to disturb the sky. I ran my palm along the kitchen counter and felt the grooves where someone else's life had pressed its weight. I bought it with my quiet money and told no one for 2 weeks. Those Saturdays I disappeared up the highway and came back smelling like wood smoke and pond air, my fingers raw from sanding a crooked shelf straight. In those hours, I remembered how to listen for my own voice. It sounded shy at first, then it didn't. Ethan found out by mistake. We sat in a banker's office while a woman in a navy blazer typed our information and squinted at her screen. "Huh," she said, "Pine Grove Mortgage Company?" Ethan's head snapped toward me, confusion sliding into anger the way a storm slides across open water. We didn't argue there. We saved that for home, where Margaret and Richard arrived within the hour as if he'd pulled a fire alarm. They assembled me in the living room. Margaret perched on the sofa, pearls shining like tiny moons. Richard stood with his hands behind his back, a principal awaiting confession. Ethan paced, the rhythm of a man trying on righteousness. "Why would you buy something like that?" he demanded. "With what money?" The implication wasn't a question, it was a charge. "I earned it," I said, and felt the smallest tremor in my voice. "I wanted a place to breathe." "Marriage is transparency," Margaret said, smoothing her skirt. "Hiding purchases is not transparency." She smiled kindly, the way a gate smiles while it closes. Richard used words like stability, prudence, shared goals. He asked if I'd considered insurance, maintenance, taxes, as if I hadn't built spreadsheets and contingency plans by candlelight at the cabin table. I tried to explain, about the quiet, the way my chest loosened on the drive north, how I could hear myself in the trees. They looked at me as if I'd announced a commune. After that day, the cabin became a punchline at dinners, Ethan calling it my midlife hobby, Mason asking if I'd become a hermit writing manifestos. I learned to keep my photographs to myself. I kept building, even if the only person who saw the progress was the morning light climbing my new bookshelf. The more I loved that place, the more the family resented it. The cabin stood as a rebuke to their favorite myth, that everything good in my life came from the Whitmores and should be offered back in gratitude. They believed generosity conferred ownership. The cabin proved otherwise. In year 5, when my salary passed Ethan's, Richard's conversations about finances grew noticeably more private. They happened with doors almost closed, hushed over scotch. I heard Ethan say the word optics more than once, as if optics could balance a budget. When I mentioned contributing more to the mortgage, Margaret patted my hand and said, "We'll let Ethan handle the big picture." She used the same tone one might use to assure a child her finger painting mattered. By then I had learned the geometry of their affection. Approval flowed most freely when I reduced myself. Make the salad, refill the glasses, put away the good knives, and the evening would end in a softness that almost resembled peace. Speak too boldly about work, about dreams, about the cabin, and I'd spend the ride home apologizing for making people uncomfortable. The assignment overseas arrived the way real change does, abruptly and after a long time coming. My firm won a national contract, and someone needed to coordinate a complicated compliance lift across Asia. My name rose. There was a clearance process, the kind with long forms and longer interviews. For weeks, I told strangers the truth about my life, and they listened with pens poised as if my answers mattered. When the call came through, "You're our first choice," I felt a quiet click inside me like a key finding the right lock. I set the house in order the way I always had: spreadsheets, schedules, contingencies. For the cabin, extra care. a management company that served deployed military families, bill payments on autopilot, a folder labeled in bright marker, emergency only. I told Ethan what it meant, that my work required systems to know about my assets, that transfers would be flagged. He laughed. It's a shack, Maddie, no one cares. He signed the forms like he was scratching an itch. In Singapore, the air wrapped close and humid, and yet I could breathe. My days were dense with work and competence. People asked for my opinion and paused to hear it. At night from a hotel balcony, I watched the bay hold the city's lights like a promise. On video calls, Ethan smiled with half his mouth, distracted, the sounds of his parents' kitchen clattering in the background. I told myself it was the time zones. Week by week, the family dinners continued without me. I could trace them from the photos: Margaret's seasonal centerpiece, Richard's blazer, Mason's raised glass. Sometimes there was a new shadow at the edge of a frame, a figure I didn't yet know would soon sit where I had sat. In my room, I unrolled the printed cabin reports, all systems normal, and felt steadier just seeing the words. The pond glinted on a tiny screen. A deer drifted through a morning frame, and I remembered that not everything had to be loud to be real. Back at the long table that autumn night, Ethan held court beneath Margaret's chandelier, loving the sound of himself. The family's faces shone with relief. The errant piece of our story had been sold off, turned into a number they understood, divided into wine and roast and validation. My phone thrummed against my leg like a small animal trying to escape. I didn't answer yet. The habit of vanishing is hard to break. It teaches you to wait, to weigh, to swallow. But even the best art of disappearing ends when someone calls your name with authority. I felt it before I heard it, the pull of a different life, the one I'd begun to build in the spaces they overlooked. The call kept buzzing, insistent as the truth. I slid my napkin from my lap, set it gently by my plate, and stood. 6 years had taught me how to make myself small. The next minutes would ask me to do something I had not done in a very long time. Step fully into the room and refuse to vanish. The call was still buzzing in my pocket that night, but long before FBI agents and leather-bound folders, there had been a different phone call that set this whole story in motion. 3 years earlier, I had answered a number I didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end had changed my life. Her name was Ruth Morrison. She spoke with the warm rasp of someone who had spent most of her years outdoors, her sentences curling like smoke from a wood stove. "It's not much," she warned me, "just a cabin my husband built after he retired from the railroad. Nothing fancy, but it has a way of holding secrets." I didn't know why those words pulled at me, but I found myself driving north the next morning, telling Ethan I had a dental appointment. The road narrowed the further I went, the kind of dirt path that felt like it might shake your tires loose. And then the trees opened, and I saw it. Cedar siding weathered by years of storms, a metal roof dulled to a greenish sheen, a deck that slanted just enough to make you wonder if it would hold your weight. Behind it all, a pond stretched out like polished glass, reflecting the gold of October light. Ruth was waiting on the steps. She wore a faded flannel and boots caked with mud. She walked me through the room slowly, running her hand over door frames, pausing at a window that faced east. "My herald used to say the sunrise here was better than church," said softly. I think he was right. When she told me the price, it was almost 20,000 below what I'd expected. "I don't need the money," she explained, studying me the way people look at maps. "I just need to know this place will matter to someone, that it won't be forgotten." I signed the papers in her kitchen, using my maiden name. My hand trembled as I held the keys. They were just brass and weight, but they felt like possibility. For 2 weeks. I told no one. Each Saturday I drove back, parked in the gravel drive, and walked the rooms like they were veins in my own body. I fixed the cabinet door that sagged on its hinges. I learned how to seal a leaking faucet with the help of a hardware clerk and a YouTube video. I built shelves that leaned slightly to the left but could hold a stack of books. Every repair was a declaration. I am still here. I exist outside the Whitmores. The cabin became my sanctuary. On Friday afternoons, I'd drive north with a thermos of coffee and notebooks stacked in the passenger seat. By dusk, I'd be on the porch, listening to the frogs echo across the water. Sometimes I wrote until the ink bled through the page. Other times I just breathed, filling my lungs with pine-scented air that belonged to no one else. Ethan hated the place on sight. He called it my midlife crisis shack, a phrase he repeated to anyone who would listen. When he discovered it through a credit check, his rage had been volcanic. Within hours, Margaret and Richard had driven over, staging what they called a family meeting. They sat me down as though I were an errant employee. Margaret, in her pearls, scolded me about secrecy. Richard paced and muttered about stability. Ethan asked over and over, with what money? Mine, I said simply. Money I earned. That answer didn't satisfy them. To the Whitmores, marriage meant control. His control, their control. They twisted the story until the cabin was evidence of my selfishness, my impracticality, my failure to be a proper wife. At every Sunday dinner, the subject arose. Mason would crack jokes about me turning into a mountain hermit. Margaret would remind me of property taxes and septic systems, shaking her head like she pitied my naivete. But every insult only deepened my bond with that place. The cabin didn't dismiss me. It didn't interrupt or laugh. It stood steady among the pines, waiting each week for me to return. I learned its rhythms the way some people learn hymns. The way the boards creaked in the hallway when the wind pressed against the roof. The way morning light spilled across the kitchen table, illuminating dust motes that spun like tiny galaxies. The cabin asked nothing of me except that I arrive. That was enough. And so it became my rebellion, quiet but fierce. In the ledger of losses, the forgotten anniversaries, the uncelebrated promotions, the dinners where my name wasn't spoken, here was one entry on my side. My secret sanctuary. My proof that I could still choose myself. I didn't know then that the very thing they mocked would one day save me, or that Ethan's arrogance would turn my sanctuary into a weapon against him. All I knew was that the cabin kept me alive in a marriage designed to erase me. And for 3 years, the Whitmores never stopped underestimating just how much it mattered. Secrets rarely stay hidden in a marriage where control is mistaken for love. I learned that the hard way. For nearly 3 years, the cabin had been mine, a secret sanctuary north of the city. But one winter morning, its existence was dragged into the light, not by my confession, but by a banker's computer screen. Ethan and I were sitting in a sterile office, the kind that smells faintly of printer ink and old coffee. He had decided to refinance his car, a BMW he polished more often than he asked about my day. The loan officer typed our information, glanced at the monitor, and frowned. Looks like there's a recent inquiry here, she said. Pine Grove Mortgage Company. The words barely left her lips before Ethan turned to me, his face flipping from confusion to fury in seconds. His voice didn't rise then. The anger was too sharp for volume. He said nothing on the drive home. Silence filled the car, thick and electric. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I knew the explosion was coming. It arrived like thunder. You bought property without telling me? With what money? His voice cracked against the walls of our house, summoning reinforcements. Within an hour, Margaret's Lexus glided into the driveway, followed by Richard's Mercedes. They entered like generals arriving at a battlefield, their expressions set. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace while they arranged themselves into a tribunal. Margaret perched upright on the sofa, pearls gleaming, her lips pressed into a line of maternal disappointment. Richard stood near the mantel, hands clasped behind his back as though he were delivering a quarterly report. Ethan paced, righteous in his indignation. "Help us understand," Margaret began, her tone syrupy but edged with steel. "What kind of wife makes a major financial decision without consulting her husband?" Richard added, "Hidden money, secret purchases. These are not the actions of a stable person, Madison." They always called me Madison in moments like this. Maddie was reserved for when they wanted to sound warm, when I was being useful. But Madison was the name they used when I was being corrected. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my voice steady. The cabin cost $45,000. I paid for it with my own earnings. It didn't touch our joint finances. "That's not the point," Ethan snapped, his fist slamming the coffee table. The teacup Margaret had set rattled against its saucer. "We're supposed to be partners." The irony nearly choked me. Partners? This was a man who forgot my birthday 3 years running, who had never once asked why I came home late with ink on my fingers from freelance work. Partners in name only? But I didn't say that. I had learned long ago that defending myself only gave them more ammunition. Silence was safer. The weeks that followed were a war of attrition. Ethan refused to visit the cabin, mocking it as my crisis shack. The Whitmores turned the purchase into a family story, retold at dinners, cocktail parties, even to neighbors. Poor Ethan, married to an unstable woman who bought property behind his back. Their ridicule was constant, death by 1,000 cuts. I endured it. Then quietly I fought back in the only way I could, by loving the cabin even more. Each Friday I drove north, rebuilt what was broken, planted tomatoes in pots on the deck, learned bird calls, fixed a leaking gutter. I filled notebooks with thoughts I could never speak aloud. The cabin listened. The Whitmores did not. When their campaign against me escalated, it came with PowerPoint slides. Margaret called it a family meeting. She dimmed the lights in the dining room, projecting graphs and bullet points onto a portable screen. Projected property tax increases, septic system failure probabilities, roof replacement costs. Each slide painted my sanctuary as a looming catastrophe. This is what happens, she concluded, when decisions are made without proper guidance. Mason chuckled from his chair. Are you sure you're not running a weed farm out there, Maddie? You disappear every weekend. Richard leaned forward, brows knit with concern. Or meeting someone? His implication was clear. And Ethan, as always, sat silent, not defending me, not protecting me, letting their words fall like stones while he pretended neutrality. When their accusations finally paused, I pulled out my phone. My hands trembled, but my voice did not. I showed them photos of the garden I had coaxed into bloom, of the bookshelves I built crooked but proud, of the desk by the window where morning light spilled across my pages. They stared at the screen for less than 3 seconds before Margaret snapped the phone shut and handed it back. Well, she said, her smile thin, everyone needs hobbies. The word hobbies dripped with condescension, erasing months of work, years of sacrifice, and the only thing keeping me alive inside their suffocating orbit. That night, driving home from the Whitmore house, the cabin's image burned in my mind. My garden, my shelves, my pond, they could dismiss it all they wanted, but the cabin had become more than wood and earth. It was proof that I still had a self worth saving. And deep down, I knew, one day that self would be tested. One day my silence would not be enough. The breaking point came not in a burst of anger, but in the cool, clinical language of a contract. It was February when my managing director, James Harrison, called me into his office. The city outside his window was wrapped in fog, skyscrapers dissolving into gray. James stood there with a folder in his hand, his expression equal parts pride and relief. We landed the Rach contract, he said. Worth $12 million to the firm, and Maddie, you're our lead. The words settled over me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. Lead, trusted, chosen. For once, my name was circled at the top of the list, not tucked somewhere below Ethan's family tree. The job would send me across Asia, Singapore, Seoul, Tokyo for 4 months. It was intense, requiring the kind of high-level security clearance only a handful of us held. I had passed that scrutiny months earlier. Every account, every asset, every decision combed over by federal investigators who wanted to be sure I was who I said I was. And I was. When I told Ethan that night over dinner, his fork froze halfway to his mouth. Why would they send you? Don't Harrison or Kumar have more seniority? Because I have the clearance, I said evenly, though my heart thudded at the familiar sting of doubt. He chewed his steak slowly, eyes narrowing. A woman alone for 4 months? Can't you do it remotely? Within an hour, Margaret's voice crackled through the phone, sharp as static. Madison, leaving your husband for months at a time? Don't you think that's rather selfish? Marriage requires sacrifice. Sacrifice. In their dictionary, that word always meant mine. Still, I prepared meticulously. I automated every bill. I left Ethan an emergency folder, 15 pages thick, with contacts, schedules, instructions. I highlighted one section 3 times. The cabin is a federally registered asset. Emergency access only? Ethan flipped through it, chuckling. It's just a shack, Maddie, not Fort Knox. He tossed the folder onto the counter where it sat untouched. What he didn't realize, and what gave me quiet strength, was that the very cabin they despised now carried a weight in Washington. Because of my clearance, the property was logged in federal databases, flagged as protected. It wasn't just my sanctuary anymore. It was secured by the same government that sent me overseas. When the plane touched down in Singapore, humidity wrapped around me like a second skin. And yet, for the first time in years, I could breathe. My hotel room overlooked Marina Bay, where the lights glittered like spilled jewels. Each night I stood on the balcony, shoulders lowering from their permanent hunch. The work was grueling, but it was mine. Each morning I walked into rooms where my expertise mattered. People listened. They wrote down what I said. They asked follow-up questions instead of dismissing me with a nod. My report saved millions in potential fines, and clients praised me with words Ethan had never learned: indispensable, brilliant, essential. At night, I called home. At first, Ethan picked up. He asked questions like he was checking a box. How's the work? When are you back? But his eyes flicked elsewhere on the screen, his attention divided. By week 3, he stopped showing up altogether. His excuses piled up: meetings, dinners, bad connection. But social media told me the truth. Photos surfaced of family dinners, Ethan sitting between Margaret and Richard, wine glass raised. Sometimes Mason's girlfriend, Ava, sat closer to him than she should have. One picture caught her manicured hand on his shoulder, her smile too bright to be accidental. The caption read, "Great evening with the whole family. Complete at last. Complete, as if I had never been there." I checked the cabin cameras every morning, sipping hotel coffee while the screen showed deer wandering past or rain pattering against the pond. The management company sent weekly emails, all systems normal. Those 2 words steadied me more than any message from Ethan. By month 3, he barely replied to my texts. Busy, he wrote once. Later, he wrote another time. But the Whitmores were busy posting photos of laughter, toasts, dinners, all without me. One evening, standing on my hotel balcony, I closed the laptop after scrolling through another set of images. Ethan, Ava, the family gathered like I had never existed. The city pulsed below, neon lights trembling on the water. My chest tightened not with grief but with clarity. I wasn't losing a family. I was finally seeing the truth of one I had never truly belonged to. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew the cabin would be the fault line where their control cracked. They just didn't know it yet. Distance doesn't always create longing. Sometimes it sharpens the edges of what was already dull. By the time I reached my 3rd month abroad, Ethan and I were no longer husband and wife across an ocean. We were strangers occupying different planets. At first, I excused the short calls. He's busy, I told myself. 14 hours of time difference makes conversation hard. But the truth seeped in through small cracks, his voice distracted, the sounds of plates and laughter behind him, the way his eyes darted away from the camera when we did connect. One Tuesday, I scheduled a video call. I sat at the desk in my hotel room in Tokyo, notes spread out from a day of meetings. The screen lit up, Ethan's face filling the frame. Behind him, I heard Margaret's voice, cheerful and commanding. "Pass the potatoes, Ethan." My heart sank. He was at family dinner while speaking to me. "You're not even listening," I said quietly. "I am," he insisted, though his gaze was fixed on something off-screen. "I'm just busy here." Busy at a dinner table that had always found room for everyone but me. By the following week, he stopped picking up altogether. My messages went unanswered for hours, then days. When he did respond, it was with single words: "Fine." Later: "Busy." But the Whitmore social media was busy too. Busy documenting what they wanted the world to see. Ethan at dinners, Ethan at concerts, Ethan with Ava standing just a little too close. One photo captured her hand resting on his shoulder, her nails painted the deep red Margaret favored. The caption read, "Family night out with the best company." I stared at that picture until the skyline outside my window blurred. They weren't subtle. They didn't need to be. In their world, I had become a ghost, erased before I'd even returned. Still, every morning I checked the cabin cameras. They became my anchor. Deer nibbling at the grass, raccoons nosing through the compost, fog curling off the pond at dawn. Those images told me I still had something untouched by them. All systems normal, the weekly report said. and I clung to those words like scripture. Meanwhile, the Whitmores grew louder in their absence. Margaret began sending me articles, women who chose their careers and lost their families, stories of wives who abandoned their duties and ended up alone. She signed each email, "Concerned for your marriage, Margaret." The family group chat told a harsher story. One morning, I opened my phone and found an error. "You are no longer a participant in this conversation." When I asked Ethan, he claimed it was a glitch, but photos proved otherwise. The group carried on without me. Ava sat in my seat at the table, smiling, pouring wine. It was a peculiar kind of cruelty, being alive but treated like I'd already been replaced. Some nights in Singapore, I stood on the balcony with a glass of wine from the hotel minibar, watching ships glide across the bay. I thought about the years I had spent trying to be small enough to fit into their mold. I thought about Margaret's pearls glinting in judgment, Richard's booming lectures, Mason's jokes, Ethan's silence. I thought about how I'd bent myself into invisibility just to survive their world. And then I thought of the cabin, the shelves I'd built, the garden I'd planted, the quiet that welcomed me like an embrace. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. The Whitmores could erase me from their tables, their photos, their group chats, but they could not erase the cabin. They didn't yet understand that in mocking it, they had underestimated it. They had underestimated me. When my assignment neared its end, I packed my suitcase in a room that had started to feel more like home than my house in Michigan. Outside, the lights of the city shimmered on the water, 1,000 tiny affirmations. I was going back. But I wasn't returning as the same woman who had left. And though I didn't know it yet, the cabin, the very thing they dismissed as useless, was already in motion, already waiting to turn their world upside down. The flight home stretched across 16 hours and 3 time zones. I sat by the window, watching the slow crawl of daylight across the wing, rehearsing in my mind how it would feel to step back into my life. I told myself that absence softens edges, that maybe Ethan would be at the gate, waiting with a sign or flowers, some gesture to acknowledge the 4 months apart. When we landed in Detroit, I wheeled my luggage to the carousel and scanned the crowd. Families reunited in bursts of joy, lovers collided in embraces, even business travelers shook hands with drivers holding cardboard signs. I waited 10 minutes, 20, 40. Ethan never came. Finally, my phone buzzed, a text at Mom's. "She's preparing a special dinner for your return. Come straight here." The words sliced cleaner than a knife. He hadn't even considered showing up. Not for me, not for us, only for them. I slid into a taxi, the driver cheerfully asking, "Homecoming?" I nodded, unable to answer. The route wound past our neighborhood. As we turned the corner, I asked him to slow down. My stomach dropped. Through the living room window, I saw furniture I didn't recognize. A leather sectional sat where my blue sofa used to be. Abstract paintings hung where my carefully chosen photographs once lived. The garden I had tended with aching knees and dirt-stained gloves was gone, replaced by sterile landscaping from a catalog. 2 unfamiliar cars sat in the driveway, a gleaming BMW newer than Ethan's and a red sports car that screamed youth and arrogance. "This your house?" the driver asked, noticing my stare. "I'm not sure anymore," I whispered. I had him drop me at the corner, then dragged my suitcase up the walk. My key still worked, but the house inside wasn't mine. The kitchen smelled different, synthetic candles instead of simmered rosemary. The spice rack I had alphabetized had vanished, replaced by decorative jars, probably empty. I walked into the bedroom and froze. The sheets were new, untouched by the creases of familiarity. The closet bulged with Ethan's clothes, spread into my section. My blouses and dresses had been shoved into one corner, wrinkled, forgotten. On the dresser sat a perfume bottle I didn't own, its glass catching the light like evidence. I set my suitcase down, unopened. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I turned, walked out, and drove to the Whitmore's house. The driveway looked like a car dealership. Margaret's Lexus, Richard's Mercedes, Mason's Range Rover, Ethan's BMW, and 2 others I didn't recognize lined the pavement. The house glowed with warm light, laughter spilling through the windows. Inside, the dining room sparkled as if staged for magazine spread. Margaret had brought out her heirloom crystal, the kind reserved for weddings and Christmas. The chandelier blazed. Decanters of expensive wine sat open on the table. Everyone was dressed as though this dinner was a coronation. I stepped into the hallway unnoticed at first, listening. Margaret's voice carried above the others. He handled it brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. When I finally entered, their heads turned with feigned delight. Maddie, Margaret said, her pearls catching the light. Perfect timing. We were just about to toast. At the head of the table sat Ethan, smiling with a confidence I'd never seen before. He didn't rise to greet me. He didn't ask about my flight. Instead, he lifted his glass. Actually, he said, commanding the room, before we eat, I have something important to share. And with those words, I felt the air tighten, because I knew instinctively that whatever came next would not just change the evening, it would change everything. Ethan tapped his fork against his wine glass, and the room stilled. I had seen him invisible at this table 100 times before, half listening, slouched, barely noticed. But tonight he stood taller, voice carrying with the authority of a man who believed he had finally proven his worth. You all know about Madison's little cabin, he began, stretching the words little cabin with a smirk, as though it were a child's dollhouse and not the sanctuary I had built. My shoulders stiffened at his tone. Well, I finally did something about it. I sold it, $60,000, closed the deal last month while Maddie was overseas. The words hit me like stones. For a beat, silence hung over the table. Then, as though rehearsed, the Whitmores erupted. Richard clapped slowly, deliberate as if chairing a shareholder meeting. Smart move, son, very smart. Margaret gasped, hand to her pearls. Oh, Ethan, you've rescued this family from her impracticalities. Mason let out a low whistle. 60 grand for that shack? You must have hustled, bro. Ava clapped her manicured hands together, her eyes fixed on Ethan like a woman applauding her leading man. Their laughter spread, clinking glasses like it was New Year's Eve. The sound washed over me, loud and suffocating. I sat still at the far end of the table, as though bolted to the chair. My phone vibrated again in my pocket, once, twice, then again, the unknown number flashing insistently, but I didn't move, not yet. Ethan pointed to the lavish spread on the table, catered dishes I recognized from a French restaurant downtown. See this dinner, the wine, the roast, the dessert, all paid for. At least one meal is covered, he said with a grin. The family roared. Margaret laughed until her eyes watered. Mason slapped the table. Even Ava leaned toward Ethan, her laughter a touch too intimate. I felt my jaw tighten, but my face remained smooth, neutral, unreadable. Years of practice. Then Ethan reached under his chair and pulled out a leather folder, the kind lawyers carry into courtrooms. He spread papers across the white linen tablecloth with a flourish. The best part is how I handled it myself, he bragged. Researched comparables, negotiated 3 competing offers, saved thousands in agent fees. Brilliant, really. Richard leaned forward, nodding approvingly. Resourcefulness, that's what makes a man successful. Mason squinted at the signatures. How'd you get Maddie to sign all this from overseas? Ethan's grin widened. Took me 3 days of practice, but I got it perfect. Used her old journals, matched the curves of her letters, the pressure of her pen. By the end, even I couldn't tell the difference. Margaret examined the forged signatures and smiled. Remarkable, Ethan, absolutely remarkable. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, rattling against the chair. This time, I slipped it out under the tablecloth. Screen glowing with the caller ID, Harrison Blackwell, attorney at law. I didn't recognize the name, but something in my gut told me to step away. Through the glass of Margaret's French doors, I could see the October night settling over her manicured garden. The air beyond that glass looked cleaner than anything inside. I rose quietly, napkin folded on my plate. Excuse me, I murmured, my voice steady despite the storm breaking loose in my chest. No one noticed. They were too busy leaning over Ethan's shoulder, admiring his crime as though it were a trophy. I stepped onto the porch, phone pressed to my ear. Mrs. Whitmore? A man's voice broke through, sharp with panic. This is Harrison Blackwell. I represent the buyers in your cabin purchase. The word purchase cut deeper than I expected. My stomach turned cold. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwell? I asked, my voice calm, professional. He exhaled raggedly. Why are federal authorities at our office? They've seized documents, asked questions about restricted property sales, and used words like fraud and forgery. What exactly did your husband sell us? Behind me, through the glass, Ethan laughed at something Mason said, his hand sweeping across the papers like a showman. Margaret poured more wine. Ava tilted toward him, smiling like she belonged there. I kept my eyes on them as I answered softly, Mr. Blackwell, I think you should explain exactly what transaction you believe you've made. Because in that moment, I understood. Ethan's triumph was about to become his undoing. And the Whitmores, smug, applauding, oblivious, had no idea that the storm was already on its way. Your husband provided every document. Harrison Blackwell's voice tumbled out, breaking against the night air. The deed, title, insurance forms signed in your name. 6 weeks ago, $60,000 was wired to your joint account. But now the FBI is here, calling it a restricted property. They're using words like federal violation and conspiracy. Mrs. Whitmore, what did your husband drag us into? His desperation vibrated through the phone, but my own pulse slowed into clarity. For years I had been invisible at that dinner table, ignored until I blended into the wallpaper. Tonight, that invisibility became my shield. Ethan believed my silence was submission. He didn't realize silence can be strategy. I've been overseas for 4 months, I said evenly. This is the first I'm hearing of any sale. I'll review the details and call you back. I hung up before he could stammer more excuses. My reflection glimmered in the glass door, calm, almost detached, while behind me Ethan played the conquering hero to his family. He had no idea the stage lights were about to go dark. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. The sender, Special Agent Catherine Reeves. I remembered her sharp eyes from my clearance interview, the way she had asked about every corner of my life. Her message was short. Mrs. Whitmore, situation regarding Pine Grove property is active. Maintain normal behavior. Do not alert subjects. Team mobilizing. Ida 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, steadying my breath. When I returned to the dining room, no one looked up. Ethan was in full performance mode, describing how he had found my little safe, how I'd foolishly kept the combination set to our anniversary date. He recounted every step of his forgery like a magician revealing a trick, each detail applauded as genius. Richard nodded, eyes gleaming. That's control of wasteful assets, son, the kind of vision we've been waiting for. Margaret raised her glass, pearls glowing under the chandelier. Finally, Ethan is proving himself. Ava leaned toward him, her hand brushing too close to his, her smile too wide. You must be so proud, Maddie. Ethan took such good care of things while you were gone. I met her gaze steady. Yes, I said softly. He certainly took charge of something that wasn't his to take. The words hung like smoke, but they didn't hear the warning. They laughed it off, clinking glasses again. I lowered my eyes to my plate, the weight of my phone pressing against my leg. Every tick of Margaret's grandfather clock in the hallway was another second closer. 10 minutes. 9, 8. Ethan launched into his grand finale, outlining investment plans for the 60,000, Mason's new venture, property flips, real opportunities. The family leaned forward like disciples at a sermon, blind to the storm gathering just beyond their gated lawn. 7 minutes. 6. Margaret served her tiramisu, the dessert she reserved only for victories. To Ethan, she said, her voice thick with pride, for being resourceful, decisive, and for showing us what leadership looks like. They lifted their forks. I didn't. My eyes fixed on the window where headlights curved into the drive with military precision. 1, 2, 3 black SUVs. 5 minutes. The beams cut across the dining room wall, sweeping like searchlights. Richard blinked. Who on earth? I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against Margaret's polished floors slicing through their chatter. I'll get the door, I said, though no one had knocked. Ethan barely glanced at me. Always working, he chuckled. You should relax, Maddie. Enjoy the moment. 3 minutes. I walked down the hallway, each step deliberate, my breath calm. My hand hovered at the brass handle just as a firm knock rattled the frame. When I opened the door, Special Agent Reeves stood flanked by 5 other agents, dark suits crisp, badges gleaming. Her eyes met mine, steady, professional, but carrying the faintest flicker of recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "are all subjects present?" "They're in the dining room," I answered. My voice didn't waver. "All of them having dessert. 2 minutes." The agents moved past me with choreographed precision, boots tapping like a countdown. The house that had always dismissed me was about to witness me in full, not as a ghost, not as a servant, but as the quiet hinge on which their entire world turned. 1 minute. I followed them back toward the dining room, my silence intact. Ethan's laugh rang out one final time before it collapsed under the weight of 6 federal agents stepping into Margaret's crystal-lit theater. The storm had arrived. The Whitmore dining room froze the moment the agents appeared. The chandelier glowed too brightly, illuminating every startled face like a stage spotlight. Forks hovered midair, tiramisu poised but uneaten. Agent Reeves stepped forward, badge raised. Her voice carried the kind of authority that makes denial impossible. "Ethan Whitmore, you are under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit interstate commerce violations." The words detonated in the silence. Ethan's wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering on Margaret's pristine rug. Red spread through the fibers like blood. He stumbled to his feet, voice breaking. "This is insane. It was just a property deal, just a cabin, nothing more." Reeves didn't flinch. "Selling federally registered property with forged documents isn't a simple transaction, Mr. Whitmore. It's a federal crime." The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Final and cold. Margaret screamed, rising from her chair, clutching at her pearls as if they could shield her. "There's been a mistake," she cried. "My son was just being resourceful." Richard tried to intervene, his boardroom voice trembling. "You can't just come into our home." "Sit down, sir," another agent commanded, and Richard obeyed, collapsing into his chair with the air of a man whose kingdom had just crumbled. The agents moved with methodical efficiency, photographing the forged documents spread across the linen, recording the champagne bottles, noting the catered feast Ethan had bragged about. Every scrap of his arrogance transformed into evidence. Mason pressed himself against the wallpaper, face pale, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Ava clutched her wine glass so tightly her manicured nails dug into the stem. "I barely know them," she whispered, though photos of her at family gatherings contradicted the lie before it left her lips. Ethan's eyes darted to me, desperate. "Maddie, tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're my wife, you know I had every right to sell it. Tell them." For years I had been silenced, dismissed, reduced to nothing at this very table. Tonight I finally understood the power of saying nothing at all. I met his gaze and stayed quiet. "You can't testify against me," he stammered, wild now, clinging to half-remembered legal myths. "You're my wife, spouses can't testify." Agent Reeves cut him off. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, in cases involving crimes against a spouse, testimony is admissible. But we don't need her. Your confession here tonight, the forged documents, the transfer of a federally protected asset, that's more than enough." The weight of her words pressed down on the room. Margaret collapsed into her chair, mascara streaking, muttering, "This isn't happening, this isn't happening." Richard sat with his head in his hands. Mason whispered furiously that he had nothing to do with it. Ava's carefully constructed composure cracked. Tears smeared her makeup, leaving tracks down her cheeks. The Whitmore dynasty, so smug, so unshakable, was unraveling before my eyes. And me? I sat with my hands folded, steady as stone, watching their kingdom burn around them. My silence, once their favorite weapon, had become my armor. The clock in the hallway ticked on, steady and indifferent. The agents read Ethan his rights. Margaret begged. Richard blustered. Mason shook. Ava wept, and I, finally, breathed. The empire that had built itself on dismissing me had collapsed in a single night, undone not by my words, but by Ethan's own arrogance. And as the agents led him past me, cuffed and broken, he hissed through clenched teeth, "You did this to me." But he was wrong. He had done it to himself. The storm had come and gone, and the only thing left standing in its calm center was me. The next morning dawned with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, the house was quiet in a way that wasn't suffocating. It was mine. Not ours, not theirs, mine. My phone had been buzzing since midnight. Unknown numbers, reporters hungry for a statement, Margaret's attempts to call through blocked ID, messages that piled up without end. I ignored them all. The world could chatter. I had lived too long in noise. Silence was my gift. By noon, the first domino fell. The title company that processed Ethan's fraudulent sale was raided by federal agents, their license suspended. Real estate agents who had celebrated the transaction on social media suddenly found their careers in ruins. Even Margaret's proud Facebook post, "My brilliant son just made the deal of the year," was now evidence in the case. Within days, the Whitmore's world collapsed. Mason, cornered, flipped immediately, testifying against his own brother and parents. Richard and Margaret, once untouchable in their circles, faced questioning about suspicious transfers, vacations paid for with stolen funds, and their knowledge of Ethan's schemes. Their country club friends crossed the street to avoid them. Their dynasty of condescension turned to ash. And Ethan, he sat in federal custody, stripped of his arrogance, awaiting sentencing. 4 years without parole, the judge ruled weeks later, plus restitution he could never hope to repay. The man who forged my name could no longer speak it without shackles clinking at his wrists. As for me, I reclaimed everything. The divorce was swift, the judge disgusted by Ethan's crimes. Michigan law showed no mercy to husbands who robbed their wives. The suburban house, the accounts, even Margaret's heirloom crystal, it all came to me. But the only thing I truly wanted was the cabin. When I returned, it stood waiting, sturdier than I had left it. The property management company had cared for it, but now it was mine again in the truest sense. The dirt road had been graveled, the deck reinforced. Federal restitution had turned my sanctuary into something even stronger. I sat on the porch one evening, wine glass in hand, watching the pond reflect the late October sun. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Neighbors who once whispered now greeted me with casseroles, with warmth. My firm doubled my contracts. Clients sought me out, drawn not only to my expertise, but to the quiet strength they sensed in me. My life expanded, not with noise, but with meaning, and yet the cabin remained the center of it all. The one place that taught me invisibility was not weakness, but patience. The place where silence, once my prison, became my power. A year to the day after that infamous dinner, I sat on the deck again. The air was crisp, the pines whispering overhead. My phone sat untouched beside me. No calls, no interruptions, no Whitmores, just me. The woman who had endured and survived and finally thrived. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with me through this story. May you carry from it the reminder that silence does not mean surrender, and that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. I wish you health, peace, and a family that cherishes you. Hold tight to your own cabin, whatever form it takes, your sanctuary, your freedom, your truth. With gratitude, Madison Chen.